Hello, it's Aaron Renn. Welcome back. Welcome back to my series of perspectives from people with minority religions in America. Again, evangelicals are now a minority. Maybe they were never as big a majority as maybe some of us would have thought, but now clearly a minority. And so I wanted to bring people on from various perspectives to hear about what life has been like as a religious minority in America. And today I'm very pleased to be able to share a guest with you who's Jewish, Josh Hammer. You may already know Josh, at least virtually, because he's written for many publications that you no doubt know. He's a senior editor at large at Newsweek Magazine. He's a fellow at the Edmund Burke Foundation, which are the people behind the national conservatism movement. He's the host of the Josh Hammer Show, which is a syndicated podcast, many other things. And he's also the author of the new book, Israel and Civilization. There's a link to that and all things Josh in the show notes. So Josh, thanks for joining me.
Aaron, longtime admirer of your work, so thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really struggled to think about who should I have on to give a Jewish perspective. Made me think of Dave Chappelle's opening line from his Saturday Night Live monologue that two words you should never say together are "the" and "Jews." Because as you point out, if you get two Jews, you get three opinions. And
it's funny because this notion of two Jews, three opinions, I'm sure we'll get into this, but this literally goes back as far as the Talmud. I mean, literally arguing is like ingrained in the Jewish tradition. I mean, there've literally been books written about how vociferous and at times ferocious Talmudic disputes are. So this notion of kind of argumentation and sharing opinions is deeply ingrained in our tradition.
Yeah, there's this old joke that this Jewish guy is stranded alone on a desert island, and when he's rescued, the rescuers find that he had built two synagogues. And they ask him, "Why did you build two synagogues?" He says, "One's to pray in, and one I wouldn't be caught dead in." And I wouldn't tell that as good as a Jewish comedian would, but we're not. I'm German. We're not known for being great comedians. My Italian side maybe didn't come through as much as it could have. But thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
And you sort of hit multiple, I think, aspects of the Jewish experience because, like a lot of Jewish people, you were raised in a largely secular, maybe vaguely reformed-ish home. And then later in life, you became a fully observant, Orthodox, as you say, Jew. So you're practicing all the Jewish laws today. And you're, a staunch Zionist as well. So you've got that perspective. So hopefully we can hit on all those today. So again, you were raised in this largely secular home. Like, when did you first kind of learn that you were Jewish and most other people weren't?
Well, I think I was aware of that from a fairly young age. I mean, I was raised in a secular home. A very assimilated home is probably the slightly better adjective. I mean, it wasn't secular insofar as there was no exposure whatsoever to Judaism, like many of the other assimilated reform or reform adjacent to Jews, you might say, around where I grew up. I had exposure to some of the more commercially popular holidays. So Hanukkah, we certainly would light the menorah and spin the dreidel and do gifts. We would go to a Passover Seder, but it was a kind of Passover Seder, and I think I actually read this in the book, where my father would basically go get a slice of pizza like the night after the Seder, which, if anyone knows anything about the laws of Passover, that's totally verboten. You're not allowed to have any bread. So it was not a religiously observant home. Certainly one of the cornerstones of the Jewish faith is the Sabbath, the Shabbat. That's really kind of one of the hallmarks of Judaism, of Orthodox Judaism. I genuinely do not think I don't think I knew what a Shabbat dinner was until I was in my teenage years. So that says all you need to know about assimilation. But I definitely knew that I was Jewish. My paternal grandmother, who's still 95 and a half years old, God bless her, and to this day, actually, she will light Shabbat candles every Friday evening. She has a kosher kitchen. So there were traces of kind of prior generations. I think that it maybe just skipped my parents' generation a little bit for one reason or another. But it definitely was ingrained in me, instilled in me from a very, very young age that I was Jewish. Having said that, I've always been passionate about a very young age. This is one of the many reasons I was excited to talk to you. But I've always been passionate from a very young age about Jewish-Christian relations because I grew up in an assimilated environment. I went to public school K through 12 as an assimilated American Jew. And my best friend from childhood was a religious Christian, actually. And I remember kind of these conversations on the playground. I remember his mother, an amazing woman, may her memory be a blessing, tragically passed away many years ago. But I remember her inviting my mother over for Bible study, and my mother kind of politely declining. So I actually do have memories of this. But we really were quite assimilated. I'm not sure if this is in the book, actually, but we actually even growing up would go to my mother's house on Christmas Day, where she had a Christmas tree and stockings and all of that there. And my mother's mother is fully Jewish under Jewish law, but I don't remember the exact reason for it. But I think it was her mother, my great grandmother, who I never met, dabbled in messianic something. I don't remember the exact details, to be honest with you, but we did Christmas for most of my growing up there. So I knew
Oh,
that I was
interesting.
Jewish, but I knew that I was pretty assimilated as well.
Well, you said you were passionate about being Jewish. What did your Jewish identity mean to you at that time of your life?
Not necessarily what it means today, I think would be like the right way of phrasing it. So, look, the proper conception of what Judaism means actually is that we are a people of laws and commandments and action, and actually doing the acts, the mitzvot, as we call them there. I certainly had no conception of that whatsoever growing up, right? I vaguely knew that there were kosher dietary laws. I honestly struggle to remember what, if anything, I knew about Shabbat, about the Jewish Sabbath. I didn't know a whole lot, to be honest with you. I knew that Yom Kippur was a very serious day.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely did not know the details that go into the Day of Atonement and all the various restrictions and laws and so forth there. So growing up, it was more of a Judaism. As look, I was aware that there were 6 million Jews who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. I think that various generations of American Jews grew up with this firmly kind of instilled in them, this sense of Holocaust education and a general just Holocaust awareness and so forth there. I knew that there were any number of public Jews for whom I could culturally be proud. I mean, Jerry Seinfeld, right? I mean, I knew that I could be proud of Jerry Seinfeld for being kind of a trend-setting Jewish comedian. I knew vaguely as a big baseball fan growing up that I could be proud of the fact that Sandy Koufax famously did not pitch in the World Series on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. But again, beyond that, it didn't necessarily mean a whole lot, other than various cultural totems like eating bagels and lox and things like that. There was certainly no actual ritualistic, like actually authentic religious component to it.
Yeah, you mentioned the Holocaust. That was my next question. Like, when did you learn about the Holocaust and the history of anti-Semitism? And like, how does that affect American Jews' perception of their place in America? I guess.
So I couldn't tell you exactly when I first learned about the Holocaust. It must have been when I was fairly young, honestly. I certainly at some point in elementary school, I became aware of it, and it's a very sobering thing when you just think about the statistics. I mean, the Jewish population today on the world stage has still not recovered from its pre-World War II number. Thank God it's getting close again. And there's this, ever lingering question: who is a Jew? How do you count as a Jew, and so forth there. But we believe that it has not quite reached its pre-World War II number. So if you consider the number of Jews around the world to be 14 to 15 million, frankly, an astonishingly tiny number, given how much people seem to talk about the Jews for various reasons. And then you also consider the fact that 6 million were slaughtered by the Nazis. I mean that's an eye gouging percentage, right? I mean it just causes the jaw to frankly just drop to the ground there. So, look, I think this plays a tremendous role, frankly, when it comes to contemporary American Jewish, diaspora Jewish, just Western Jewish identity. Is the Holocaust, and that's both a good and a bad thing. I'm actually very critical, including I think in the book sometimes, of certain types of Holocaust education. When the entire message of your religion is basically saying you should be a proud Jew because 6 million of your forebears were slaughtered by evil people, that's not a particularly inspiring message, is it?
Mm.
I think a much more inspiring message, for instance, would be the Jewish people were the original recipients of God's word. I mean, Moses and the Israelites there literally brought monotheism, brought the Bible to the world there. I mean, look at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. It's a book of Leviticus right there inscribed on the outside. To me, that is a much, much more inspiring message. So I'm critical at times of overdoing it with Holocaust education. On the other hand, it's important because this didn't happen that long ago, and this literally happened in the past century. And it's important to be aware of history and to know your Jewish history. So to give you just a couple of examples there of how it affects me, my everyday life. I will show the your viewers right now. This is in the book. I have a rock here on my desk. This is a rock that a rabbi gave me in Jerusalem roughly 6 years ago or so. It's a rock that he personally smuggled out of the crematorium of Auschwitz. And it's kind of intense, I understand, but I keep it right here next to me on my desk because I want to occasionally just look at it and like to ground me and remind me of who I am. Not that I need reminders now that I'm observant. I know I'm a Jew, but it's occasionally important just to be reminded of the history of our people.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand of the room here in my office in the closet is my Daniel Defense M4 rifle, which is decked out with all the tactical gear and the magazines and whatnot. There, I'm a big gun rights guy. That's also in the book. And I talk about, I refer to this rifle as my Warsaw Ghetto gun because I half jokingly but half seriously mean that is the gun that the Warsaw Ghetto rebels who rebelled against Nazi tyranny, they really could have potentially done a whole lot better if they had been equipped with that sort of weaponry. So thinking about the Holocaust does I think play a huge role in contemporary American Jewish life. But on the other hand, I think it can be very much overdone. And I would prefer personally to emphasize the positive things the Jewish people have done for the world rather than the negative times.
At some point, you began to take your Jewish identity and Jewish practice more seriously, became observant. Was there something that triggered that? Was there some particular event, or was it a process? How did that take place?
Very slow process. Not the kind of thing that happens overnight. Frankly, the kind of people that snap their fingers and they go from assimilated to fully observant overnight are typically the ones who burn out and don't actually last. In fact, most rabbis that I've spoken with on this issue, basically, if you're going down this path, they basically tell you go at your own pace because they don't want you to burn out there. So very slow process. The last time I had shrimp or oysters or some sort of shellfish was probably a decade ago, or maybe a little more than that, give or take there. One of the main daily Jewish rituals is wrapping what we call tefillin. That's referred to in the English translation as phylacteries. It's referred to all throughout the Torah, the Old Testament there. I started wrapping tefillin every day in 2018, 2019, more or less there. Really only over the past 3 to 4 years did I start fully observing the dietary laws, kosher, kashrut as we call it there. The Sabbath came even more recently than that there. So it was very much kind of a slow, methodical progression there. But here is kind of the simpler explanation. And this is also in the book. I think a lot of people who were raised in a religious setting, religious Christians and religious Jews alike, that is the most important part of their worldview, as of course it should be. I mean, these are the most important questions by definition. Does God exist? What is his will? And so forth. These are literally the most important questions that any given human being can ask. So if you're raised in that milieu, in that particular setting, then it just logically follows that your secondary and tertiary opinions on the other realms of life, namely the civic space and really the political space, are going to be deduced from those primary precepts. But as I say in the book, I did that in reverse. I have always been on the political right. I was literally the token. I was in middle school back when 9/11 happened. I was literally the token Bush administration defender as young as like 8th grade. So I have never ever been on the political left my entire life. I am not kind of like the old 1960s neoconservatives who shifted from left to right. I've never been of the left. And as I started to get more into conservative thought, I started reading people like Edmund Burke and Roger Scruton. One of the most important things that I saw emphasized over and over again was this notion of an intergenerational transmission of a way of life, of customs, of values. This notion of tradition and inheritance and how you have a duty to pass it on to the next generation and all that entails. And at some point, the intellectually honest or intellectually serious person in a position such as myself really has to come to terms with that and ask, okay, if I find this compelling and I am on the right, well, hold on. In my particular case, I come from literally the oldest nation that still exists today, the Jewish nation, the original people of monotheism of the book there. Why am I not looking into my own tradition? Why am I not doing my own tradition there? So it was kind of like an intellectual journey. But as an acquaintance recently said to me, he basically said, Josh, would it be an exaggeration to say that you came to Orthodox Judaism through Edmund Burke? And I kind of had to pause, and I was like, maybe a slight exaggeration, but that's more or less kind of sort of how it happened, actually.
How has kind of being, observant affected your relationship to the culture? Because it seems to me it would put a lot of limitations on you. It affects like where you can live. Like people want to invite you to go out to the dinner at the restaurant with them, and there's nothing there you can eat if you go. Like, how does that work? Whereas I gather in Israel, the patterns of life are much more set up so that it's just like normal for everybody, kind of a little bit. Not everybody's observant, but like it's much more like, oh yeah, we can do this. Whereas here, it's a lot more difficult.
Yeah. So, look, religious Jewish life doesn't require, but it is done much easier if you are living in a community. Not to get into the finer details of Jewish law, but there is something called an eruv, which is basically this wire that goes around religious observant communities. It's basically a legal loophole in halakha Jewish law that permits you to do more on the Sabbath than you otherwise would be able to do. The arcane details are really not necessary, but religious life is easier. My point is, if you live in an eruv, if you live walking distance to synagogues and things like that, it's just easier. So definitely, this has an effect to an extent. I mean, obviously, there's 6 other days of the week besides the Sabbath where one can kind of just get in the car or the bicycle, or the train, whatever, and socialize to one's, to one's content. The eating dietary laws thing is interesting, but even here too, people will take it to various extents. So if you are Haredi, if you were what the media calls ultra orthodox, you obviously would never touch anything in a non-kosher restaurant. Me personally, as someone who has become observant recently, I try to eat at kosher establishments whenever I can. I live here in South Florida. There's any number of kosher options. I strongly prefer to go there if at all possible. But if I'm in a pinch, if my wife and I are traveling to like Montana or something like that there, if need be, at this point, at least in my current trajectory, I can go to a non-kosher establishment. Then I won't order the pork, obviously, but
Right.
do the best I can, right? So that holds true at least for my present circumstances when it comes to kind of social dining interactions as well. Whether that will be the case 5-10 years from now, I couldn't necessarily tell you. I'm still kind of evolving, but that's kind of where I'm currently at, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Are people pretty understanding if you tell them that you can't do something or you need to do something on account of your Jewish religious laws?
Yeah, I have found that virtually everyone is. I can't think of a single time, honestly, where
Mm-hmm.
I've ever gotten any kind of pushback for that. And look, as someone who hosts 2 shows, the Josh Hammer Show and America on Trial with Josh Hammer, I mean that's no joke, because Sabbath is on Saturday. That's a little different because I'm not putting out daily content on the Sabbath. But the holidays, the Jewish holidays, are also fully dark, fully offline, and these are typically 2 days in a row there. So typically what I've been doing since I kind of made the full plunge, so to speak, is I will pre-record the episode for the next day. The previous day, if I can pre-record like a special edition 2 days out, then I will try to do that. Easier said than done sometimes. But to the extent that's not feasible, everyone understands. I mean,
Yeah.
no one's going to give you a hard time there. Religious liberty in this country, praise be to God, is very strong. Religious liberty jurisprudence, frankly, putting on my legal cap, is one area where the court is actually surprisingly sound. Sometimes actually even cutting across ideological lines. Not always. There are some cases still that break down, but there are some cases that surprisingly end up being 9-0, even on the religious liberty stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
So thankfully we're in a good place when it comes to all that there, and I've really never gotten any issues for it.
Hmm. Going back to the 2 Jews, 3 opinions, American Jews are very divided. Radical differences in sort of religious practice, radical differences in politics, even a lot of divisions on Israel policy, even. And so, but also there's got to be many common points of concern like anti-Semitism or other things. How do American Jews function sometimes as separate or even like rival groups, and other times in a certain pan-Jewish solidarity? How does that work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a lot to unpack there. Look, there is a massive divide, and this is something that I try to emphasize repeatedly to my fellow conservatives. There is a massive divide in America between theologically liberal Jews and theologically conservative, i.e., observant Jews. it really makes all the difference in the world, which is why in the book I'm actually deeply critical on a doctrinal basis of Reform Judaism. I kind of come after it at a very kind of core doctrinal level, because the people, and just kind of explain briefly, Reform Judaism essentially claims that Jewish law itself is not binding. That is essentially the claim, and when you do that, a lot of things go wrong. But among the things that go wrong is that you are basically freeing up. And to be clear, I'm saying go wrong for Jews, not for Christians. That's obviously a very separate matter. But if you are someone who's claiming to be a Jew and you don't believe actually in the binding nature of Jewish law there, then you are free to just focus on everything else, to focus on things that don't necessarily pertain to Jewish matters, don't pertain to religious liberty, don't pertain, obviously, to the state of Israel there. And that is why you have an overwhelming majority of theologically liberal Reform Jews who focus predominantly on totally unrelated issues, whether it's open borders immigration or environmental justice, or just basically insert your left-wing cause of the day. You've essentially supplanted Torah. You've supplanted the Bible and God's word with your own left-wing ideology, and then you're kind of putting on this very false veneer, the accoutrements, and calling it quote-unquote Judaism, but it doesn't actually resemble Judaism. You know, my old Daily Wire colleague and friend Ben Shapiro once upon a time referred to these people as ginos, Jews in name only. That's a little harsh, but he's getting at a correct point here, right? But it's important to understand that the observant Jews, like what do you call it, quote unquote modern Orthodox, Haredi, whatever label you want to use there, people who are actually trying to follow Torah, right? If you're a Jew who's actually trying to follow the Bible, we're talking here about an overwhelmingly politically conservative voting bloc. It's something like 85 to 90% based on some metrics, at least as high as 80, oftentimes higher than that. Vote for Donald Trump, vote for the Republican Party there. I had one friend who lives in Lakewood, New Jersey, which is a very well-known Haredi, quote-unquote ultra-Orthodox community. He was actually in charge of a voting precinct this past November. In his precinct, 97% went for Donald Trump. Here in South Florida, where I live, it's unheard of, frankly, to find someone in synagogue, at least the synagogues that I go to. It's unheard of to find anyone in synagogue who did not vote for Donald Trump. It's just unheard of. I mean, Kamala Harris, the modern Democratic Party, are just so obviously and unambiguously counter to everything that the Torah, everything that the Bible stands for. I mean, how in the world could you possibly vote for that?
Yeah, you know, I like the New York Times precinct viewer map where you can see where people live. And I went and looked at Chicago, where I used to live, and you can see this like bright red dot in Westridge, Lincolnwood area, which is where a lot of Orthodox Jews live. And my one Orthodox friend there, I sent him a poll. I didn't really realize, you know, how conservative Orthodox Jews were. And this was like probably a decade or more ago. I sent him a link about how Orthodox Jews were like polling Republican. He's like, Aaron, what you have to understand is we are the religious right. And it's kind of wild there. I want to talk more specifically about the book. Before we do, my last question would be, we get a lot of evangelicals, Catholics on this podcast. What do you wish Christians understood or understood better about the American Jewish experience?
About the American Jewish experience. Look, I guess I will say this. I grew up in a certain time and place. I'm well aware of kind of the circumstantial nature of my existence here on God's earth. I was born in 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall fell. I essentially grew up towards the tail end of what you might call the post-World War II golden era of Jewish life in America. It seems to me like there was this era where anti-Semitism was dramatically declining, that Jews were thriving and succeeding in essentially all fields that they did. And that seems to be partially due to this post-World War II hangover, this kind of collective guilt, not just in America, but probably in Europe and other parts of the world as well, about what had happened tragically during the Holocaust there. So as the memory of World War II and the Holocaust and all that starts to fade, and it is fading in real time there, it is difficult to, I think, separate that from rising anti-Semitism, and that is kind of its own can of worms there. But I think what's important for Christians of all stripes to understand there is that the Christians who founded this country and who led this country, and they virtually all, of course, were Christians. they were so deeply in touch with the Hebrew Bible, with the Hebrew scriptures, and in many ways actually deeply in touch with the Jewish people themselves. I mean, just talk about Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, how they wanted the national seal of the United States to be Moses parting the Red Sea with the Israelites, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, inscribed on the outside. It's not from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It's from the book of Leviticus. Thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Abraham Lincoln. I'm born on Lincoln's birthday. He's my favorite figure in American history. Lincoln famously refers to Americans as a, quote, almost chosen people, using this covenantal language of the Hebrew scriptures. Lincoln was known as a pretty private man. He grew up in a very tough upbringing, but one of the only men in his life that he was known to refer to as one of his closest friends was a Jewish man, a fellow lawyer of his from the prairie by the name of Jonas, actually. So this notion of having a connection to the Hebrew Bible, to the prophets, and frankly, just to an extent, actually just to Judaism itself, it really is ingrained, or was ingrained for a very, very long time, I think, even in the American Christian psyche. And, I think it would be an utter tragedy, not just for Jews, but for Christians, and frankly, just for the United States of America, for Christians to forget that. And it would be a tragedy as well for my fellow Jews to forget that the Christianity that has always flourished in America has been by far the most philo-Semitic, pro-Jewish, just most hospitable form of Christianity that's ever existed.
Again, my guest today, Josh Hammer. We've been talking about his experience as a Jewish man in America, and he's also the author of a brand new book that talks a little bit about that, called Israel and Civilization. And so I want to talk a little bit about the book, and that's a great segue, what you just said there, about the fading of the memory of the Holocaust, because some new Gallup polling had some really kind of wild findings. One of them was that 60% of American Democrats, I think, have a negative view of Israel. Just in general, I think it's now a minority of Americans, high 40s, that view Israel favorably. And now there's like a record high people that view sort of Palestinian cause favorably. It's up to like 33%. It seems like fading Holocaust memory may obviously play into that. But what do you think accounts for this trend, which didn't, it didn't just happen like in the last couple of weeks or something. This has been ongoing for, at least a few years.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, right? So part of the beginning of the left's turn on the state of Israel, at least, can arguably be traced as far back as the 1967 war, the Six-Day War. So for the first 19 years of Israel's existence, from its independence in 1948 until its major war against the Arabs again in 67, at that point, Israel was a genuine underdog. It was a fledgling state. It was not a particularly wealthy state. They didn't have oil like the other Arab countries had. They were genuinely struggling to survive. And then the Six-Day War happens, and it's a miraculous victory. It looks like it could have been the end of Israel less than 20 years into this experiment. And the Israeli army, praise be to God, manages to yet again turn back the tide against all these invading Arab armies from all sides. And from that point forward, the state of Israel looks like something more of a Goliath in the region than a David. The nuclear program, the generally perceived prowess of Mossad, the IDF, the military, and so forth there. And from this kind of left-wing, neo-Marxist oppressor-oppressed dichotomy there, this notion of rooting for the little people, query whether the modern left actually does that, but they sometimes espouse that, sometimes they claim they do.
They claim it.
They claim it. Yeah, and they really did start to turn on Israel. And then you kind of throw the really kind of toxic stuff into the mix, some of this racial stuff as well. They tend to look at this increasingly through this DEI-inspired lens. I mean, they were saying this before DEI was a thing. What do you want to call it? Wokeism, DEI, whatever you want to call it there. This notion that Israel is filled with a bunch of Jerry Seinfelds and Larry Davids, like quote-unquote white people, just oppressing these poor little brown people there. That plays into their petty little and frankly just stupid narrative as well. To that I just have to say that the following. Anyone who's been to Israel or knows anything knows that Israel is not comprised of a bunch of bald Larry David like Ashkenazi Jewish comedians. I myself am an Ashkenazi Jew. My wife is a Sephardic Jew. Her parents are from, one is from Tunisia, Morocco. The other is from Iraq. My father-in-law's parents had to flee Iraq, actually, due to the post-World War II pogroms against the Jews in Iraq there. A majority of Jews in Israel to this day are Sephardic or Mizrahi, actually, which means they come from basically the Middle East, and they look darker skinned, actually. In fact, fun story, it's in the book. My now wife and I, before we got engaged, we were down in Mexico, my friend's wedding there, and we were in Cancun at a resort, and the waiter tried speaking to her in Spanish, and my wife is like, no hablo español, and he just goes, look at us, same skin color. Like it was just like, so like this. I mean, this is a very kind of a dumb point, honestly. Like I hate doing the racial game, but even on its own terms, like the left's racial conception of this is just so utterly stupid and literally not borne out. So look, that is part of it there. But the most important reason why the left has turned on Israel is the most abstract reason, which is that they are engaged in a civilizational clash between civilization and barbarism. Those have been the two sides of the human duel going back at least as far as Jacob and Esau. I mean, arguably as far back as Cain and Abel. I mean, this notion of trying to build versus this notion of trying to tear down. And the left, at least as far back as Karl Marx, arguably even further, has probably even further, frankly, going back at least to the French Revolution. I mean, the sine qua non of what it means to be on the left, I would argue, is to tear down, is to destroy, is to tear down institutions, to tear down humanity, to tear down the Bible, to tear down our inheritance. This is, frankly, their overarching imperative. So, you know, to their diabolical credit, it actually makes a lot of sense that if your goal is to tear down all of what we call the West, it makes a lot of sense to start with the original people of the book. Frankly, as anti-Semites throughout history have long understood. Karl Marx understood this. His actual goal was tearing down capitalism and Christendom, but he wanted to start with the Jews. He makes that very clear in his On the Jewish Question essay, which he published a few years prior to the Communist Manifesto. So it all kind of fits when you think about it. If your goal is to tear down civilization, if your goal is to prop up the forces of paganism, barbarism, whatever exactly it is you want to call it there, it makes a lot of sense, to their great, albeit diabolical credit, to start with the original people of the book, and then by extension on the geopolitical stage, the actual state of Israel as well.
Yeah, this idea that like DEI and anti-Semitism are linked. I kind of got that from my former Manhattan Institute colleague, Seth Barron. I don't know if you know him, but
I do.
He's like, you know, a lot of these people on the left, they think Jews are like super whites. And it's like, so they're like, you know, it's like if you don't like white people, you hate Jewish people even more, because they're sort of viewed as kind of like ultra whites in a sense. Because again, I guess because of the Jerry Seinfelds and like, you know, perception they're all, you know, all successful or whatever, you know, people would have there. And I guess, you know, I think we've known that there's just been this like left-wing sort of, certainly pro-Palestinian streak that's been going on for a while. But another thing you bring up in the book is this growing sort of anti-Semitism out of sort of the dissident right or the alt-right that you see on the internet. And there's like a bunch of these accounts out there. I mean, if you mention them, you will just get flooded. My replies will just get flooded with people who are almost non-accounts that are almost like a caricature of an anti-Semite. They're so over the top. It does kind of make me wonder if they're not some kind of like Iranian bot network or something, just because there's so many of these accounts and they're so over the top. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of it out there. Like, where did this come from?
So a lot of these accounts have a shockingly high number of retweets and likes, right? I mean, like, tragically, it's not hard to find a Hitler meme on X these days that has like 50, 60,000 likes. And I totally agree with you. I have long thought that these are probably a foreign bot farming operation. Iran, Qatar, Russia, probably one of those three, if I had to guess, maybe some combination thereof. But it's really bad, whatever it is, and it's definitely a growing trend. X these days, frankly, is oftentimes a cesspool of anti-Semitism, and many people that I've talked to feel the same way, and it's unfortunate. It's genuinely unfortunate. I don't necessarily have a great solution. I think I generally am a fan of what Elon Musk does and what he stands for, so I'm I'm not calling him to kind of restore the old rules of the Jack Dorsey censorious regime, the ancient regime, or anything like that there. But there is a genuine problem here when it comes to X in particular and just mass anti-Semitism. Surely there could be some way to crack down on foreign bot farms or something like that, right? But the general thing that you're getting at here, which is very important, which is indeed this growing strand of anti-Semitism, or at least Jew skepticism, I guess we might say, in certain strands of the right. Candace Owens would be a particularly notable example here. I mean, she's really off the deep end.
Yeah, it's important to bring up. I mean, when I say they're a bot network, I mean, it's not to imply that there aren't actual real people who think this way, like Bronze Age pervert or some of them. Yeah. There actually are like real people who are promoting some of this stuff.
Right. So Bronze Age pervert, I call him out by name in the book. There's basically two types from what I can identify from like a basic rudimentary taxonomy. There's at least two different types of people on the broader right of center who seem to be increasingly and vocally anti-Semitic. On the one hand, there are people like Bronze Age pervert, and this is essentially a form of neo-paganism. I mean, this notion of lifting weights and exalting strength qua strength, that's an old Greco-Roman pagan ideal. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be in shape. I'm not saying don't exercise or anything there. But this notion this is kind of the be-all, end-all of what it means to be a man, is to be physically strong. I mean, you know, it's no exaggeration that Andrew and Tristan Tate are former MMA guys, right? I mean, it's part of this whole kind of manosphere space there. And then, of course, the Tate brothers have God knows how many other problems. Among them, this notion of trying to spread your seed far and wide, and how that's somehow a notion of manliness there. I mean, talk about a deeply anti-biblical conception there. So this is all just paganism trying to be made great again. I mean, we know from the book of Ecclesiastes that there's nothing new under the sun, and certainly so it is true here as well. The other troubling pocket of the right, from what I can tell, and I actually would be very curious on your take on this, are some people who self-identify as Christians. I personally doubt that they're personally that religious, but I guess I can't judge that. Who sometimes will put out, for instance, Christ is king, which doesn't offend me at all when it's done in like a correct sense. But when you do it in a sense where you're trying to kind of prove a point to Jews or others there. And a lot of these people, again, like Candace Owens, like I would personally argue, albeit slightly more provocatively, even Tucker Carlson, some of them there do seem to be motivated these days by trying to drive a wedge between Jews and Christians there. And that actually does seem to me to be one of the preeminent goals these days for people like Candace Owens, is they were actually trying to convince Christians, especially here in America, to basically forsake the Jews, the Jewish state, the Jewish people. And this causes me such alarm, and not merely as a Jew, Aaron, but as an American patriot, as someone who deeply cares about this country, because I am a student of history. As we were talking earlier, talking about my Warsaw Ghetto gun, I've read the history books, okay? And therefore I know that there is not a nation that has ever existed, to my knowledge, literally ever, that I can identify, that has turned on its Jewish population, has discriminated or oppressed the Jews, and has been better off for it. Here, there, and everywhere, the Jewish people and their health, security, flourishing, and prosperity are symptomatic of the broader trend. If the Jewish people are doing well, that society is probably doing well, if you had to bet. If the Jewish people are being discriminated against, that is symptomatic of a much broader societal, cultural, and civilizational decline there. So, you know, it's often said that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine, and when I see rising anti-Semitism here in the United States, thank God it's not horrific yet or anything like that, but it's definitely increased over the past 5-10 years, call it there. You know, that causes me serious pause, not merely as a Jew, but as an American who actually cares deeply about the fate of his country.
Yeah, you know, I don't follow Candace Owens all that much, but she is very nutty. I mean, she's got this campaign that Bridget Macron is really a man. Right. I'm thinking about, you know, sort of like Obama birtherism, or some of these weird, there's a lot of weird stuff. Unfortunately, I think the algorithm rewards people who are provocateurs and who produce a lot of slop. I mean, all the weird conspiracy theories that are out there as well, and sort of the whole like UFO things, and a lot of weird stuff. I don't get it, and I don't understand, candidly, I don't understand the appeal of Candace Owens. But, I saw her when she first kind of came on the scene, probably in 2015, when she was trying to be this anti-cyberbullying person. And I think she'd been a left. Actually, I don't want to get too much on Candace Owen, but I think she was originally a leftist. She was trying to kickstarter this anti-cyberbullying thing, and these other lefty women didn't want her coming in on their grift, so they had her deplatformed. And then all the conservatives loved her, and now all of a sudden she's a conservative influencer. And so she's done all these things, and I think I underestimated whatever skills she has, because she's got huge since then. But I'm like, the content is not good. I would say at least not what I've seen. So yeah, people like that. Unfortunately, some of them have just gigantic platforms, and I can't totally explain it. I do think, and this is where I want to get to evangelicals and Jews before we run out of time, is you have a whole chapter in the book really calling for essentially kind of a renewed sort of Christian-Jewish partnership around Israel. And I don't have the data. Maybe I missed it in the book, but I think it is fair to say that probably younger evangelicals are less supportive of Israel than older generations. One of the things I saw somebody put, you never know if what you see on X is real or not, but somebody posted what purported to be an excerpt from an article in the Jerusalem Post suggesting that survey data showed that only 30% of young evangelicals hold to this premillennialist end times view that was very much kind of the reason I think a lot of evangelicals of a previous gen, like in the 70s and 80s, were so pro-Israel. Sure. It was sort of a weird end times theology. And I think with the Soviet Union, it seemed like we were coming to Armageddon. And now that the Soviet Union's collapsed, that theology's out of favor. And so I don't know, but it does seem that like younger evangelicals are less Israel-centric. I mean, I would say one thing. When I look at John Hagee, I think is his name, who runs Christians United for Israel. Sure. And I've never met him. I don't know him. But I look at him, and I just take one look at him, and I say, that guy looks like a cringe boomer. And, it's like there's a little too much Brill cream in his hair. And, like, I do think probably a lot of the infrastructure, if you will, whereby there was, a lot of evangelical interest in Israel was very boomer-centric. And new generations they're boomer skeptical. And so I think it doesn't really land. I would get a different spokesman besides him, because I think people are just going to take one look at it and think like a young, the young Gen XZ guy that, he's not posting on Handsome Thursdays, if you know what I mean. And again, he might be a perfectly fine guy. I just don't think that message sells with like a Gen Z or a 30-year-old, person. That's kind of my take. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. So first of all, you are definitely more the expert on this than I am, but based on the articles that I've read and the polling that I've seen, and kind of my anecdotal conversations with evangelicals, some of whom are my closest friends in the world to this day, my sense is that philo-Semitic pro-Israel evangelicalism is, if anything, actually more weighted towards Book of Genesis promises rather than eschatological concerns. So for instance, I mean, Mike Huckabee is one example. A little boomer, I get it, but when he defends his Christian Zionism, as I think he would be the first to describe it, he's talking about Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, that God shall bless those who bless the children of Israel and curse those who curse them. I'm sure eschatology has a role to play in it for sure, at least for a lot of people. But my sense, and again, you're the expert on this, not me, but my sense is that a lot of evangelicals do root it actually in Book of Genesis promises rather than the other end of the timeline, so to speak there. Now, a lot of what you said is totally correct, though. The polling absolutely does show that the younger generation of evangelicals are less instinctually pro-Israel than their parents or grandparents' generation, maybe less philo-Semitic in general, although I'm a little less certain of that, and I don't really remember the data, to be honest with you. But trying to turn back the tide against that broader trend is 1000% one of the reasons that I wrote this particular book there. It's basically just among other things, trying to remind a lot of my fellow Americans who are religious Christians there that one, the form of Christianity that has flourished in this country since its founding, really since before its founding, going back at least as far as the Mayflower itself, frankly, has always been this Old Testament heavy form of Christianity. Again, going back literally to the Jeffersonian and Benjamin Franklin imagery with the national seal, the Lincolnian language of the covenantal people. It's just imbued who we are time and time and time again there. And frankly, another thing that I do in the book actually is I try to remind people that the Hebrew Bible to this day kind of affects us in a lot of ways that we don't even think. So again, I'm a lawyer. I host 2 shows. One of them's a legal show. I've spent a lot of time talking over the past year and a half or so about lawfare and the lawfare campaigns against President Donald Trump there. One of the refrains that we hear time and time again from the left against Donald Trump is that they love to say, no one is above the law. I totally agree. It depends what the law is. But here's the more important points. Where do you guys think that's coming from? I mean, where do you actually think this notion that no man, be he a president or a monarch, a king, is above the law? It's literally from the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, John Fortescue, a great 15th century, 14 to 15th century English common lawyer and a great conservative, he actually said that the notion that the King of England is not above the law is part of the common law of England, and he made direct reference to Deuteronomy there for that exact proposition. So a lot of things that, again, we just don't think about are actually directly derived from the Hebrew Bible there. But look, more generally speaking, to really dumb it down, Aaron, I'm a religious Jew, so I don't necessarily come into contact with a Christian Bible every day, but I actually was in a library recently, and I saw a Christian Holy Bible. I picked it up there. And unless I'm greatly miscounting here, it looks to me like the New Testament is actually comparatively smaller as far as like number of pages and verses than the Old Testament, i.e. the Hebrew Bible. So we literally share like the overwhelming majority of the Holy Book. I mean, that is our joint inheritance. And it is that book, it is that worldview, it is those principles, it is those values there. When it comes to Genesis 1:27, the foundational world-altering claim that man is made in God's image there, which I argue is the single foundational ethical imperative that undergirds all of Western civilization. That is our joint inheritance of Jews and Christians alike. We share an inheritance. We face the exact same threats when it comes to wokeism, Islamism, and what I call global neoliberalism, i.e. the globalist, Soros, World Economic Forum, nation-state destroying agenda there. We have these same enemies. We share an overwhelming inheritance. And we cannot go on, I argue, without the other. We need each other. I think that the Gentile offshoot of the original tree trunk needs that tree trunk, and the Jews, as a obviously a tiny minority there, desperately need our Christian brothers in arms as well to advance our mutual causes.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm actually not an expert on evangelical views of Israel. I've more studied the gender stuff, so I kind of know what I've come in contact with from being raised in a sort of Pentecostal environment that was very kind of end times oriented. But some of it I don't know exactly, what all the drivers are for that younger generation. But I do think there was one thing in the book that I want to hit on that's a little bit of a shift, I think, from previous, that I think would be much more appealing to younger generations, just in general, the more Trumpier younger generations. And that's sort of this idea of taking a view of Israel that's more rooted in foreign policy realism. And this idea that I've seen written about a few times. I've seen some articles in the Tablet and different ones about it, but I don't know if it's like a new idea or an old idea, but certainly getting more prominence in that really the best U.S. policy for U.S. and Israel would be to wean Israel off of U.S. aid, because it sort of poisons the well in terms of people's opinion of Israel, in terms of people just don't like foreign aid in general. I think probably one of the more popular things Trump's done is shut down USAID. People are skeptical of foreign aid, and it comes with so many strings attached. Essentially, it gives the United States a veto over whatever Israel's doing. Right. And so Israel is sort of, made something of a Faustian bargain there through that. I'd love to hear you unpack that more and like what you would like to see that look like. Because again, I think that sort of language is more appealing to like the Trumpier younger people,
sure,
in terms of sort of justifications than like maybe some of the old school, boomer approaches?
Yeah, so great question, and this gets back to your previous question about Pastor Hagee and kind of this whole notion of boomerism. So
Mm.
I hear from a lot of younger conservatives that Israel is a boomer issue. They say it's a neocon issue, it's a Bush administration issue, a Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld issue. Well, the irony of that, the Bush administration, which is the high watermark of moralistic neoconservatism in America, go back and look at Bush's second inaugural address, the so-called Freedom Agenda. They were not necessarily the most over-the-top pro-Israel administration. In fact, going back to literally the waning days of the Bush administration in the lame duck period after Barack Obama won the 2008 presidential election, Condi Rice and the Bushies were literally still trying to foist this Oslo Accords-inspired two-state solution, this land for peace thing, with the Palestinian Arabs there. So they were adamant about this, and I actually argue in the book that comes from a logically consistent place. If you believe that the United States and other Western actors are capable of sculpting Madisonian democracies out of third world places, out of places where Islamism and radical Islam flourishes, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, why wouldn't you want to extend that sentiment to Judea and Samaria, to the Palestinian territories? It actually makes a lot of sense, frankly. And to this day, actually, some of the more overtly moralistic neoconservatives in Congress, Lindsey Graham comes to mind there, are much less skeptical of the Palestinian Arabs' national ambitions than I think some more foreign policy realist types are. So, the notion that Israel's a boomer issue, it's just so funny to me because, I mean, Donald Trump himself is not a neoconservative. Donald Trump himself is the guy who literally defined America First, MAGA. He's Mr. Foreign Policy Realist. Well, what was Donald Trump, among other things? By far, the most pro-Israel president of all time there, because he understands that emboldening and empowering Israel to act in a way that redounds to both of our national interests is, one, a good bang for your buck proposition when it comes to them quite literally taking out many of the enemies that have American blood on their hands, which Israel actually did last summer, among other times. Even before they took out Hassan Nasrallah.
I gotta interject just for a second, because that's how I've always looked at Israel. I'm like, Israel does our dirty work for us in the Middle East. Yeah. It's like, they bombed this Iraq nuclear reactor. They assassinated this guy over here. I'm like, yeah, we probably told them to do that. Like, we don't want to get our hands dirty, so Israel does our dirty work for us. It's like, that's kind of how I always kind of viewed Israel a little bit, as sort of like an advanced forward deploy, like U.S. Power projection thing.
Yeah, and you're not wrong to view it that way. I mean, I'll give you an even more tangible example of that. So last summer, Israel went on this killing spree against Hamas and Hezbollah from like June, July, August, September, around there, culminating in the assassinations of Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon and then Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. Before they got Nasrallah in Beirut, the decades-long head of Hezbollah, they took out two other high-ranking Hezbollah jihadis as well, by the names of Fuad Shakur and Ibrahim Akil. Who are Fuad Shakur and Ibrahim Akil? Well, they are the masterminds, respectively, of the 1983 Beirut, Lebanon bombings at the U.S. Marines barracks that slaughtered over 240 U.S. Marines. And then Akil was the mastermind of the U.S. Embassy bombing in Beirut that same year that killed, tragically, 60 to 70 Americans. Those two men, for over 4 decades, had a $5 and $7 million bounty on their heads from the U.S. State Department, respectively. They stayed alive until Israel literally killed them. So, I mean, people say to me, Josh, what does the U.S. benefit from this U.S.-Israel relationship? Well, I mean, you get a dead Ibrahim Akil, a dead Fuad Shakur, and if that weren't good enough for you, you get a dead Hassan Nasrallah and a dead Yahya Sinwar to boot. But, more generally speaking, because this is chapter 7, it's a very important chapter of the book, I feel, making this hard-headed, sober case for U.S.-Israel relations. I'm a foreign policy realist. I've actually been criticizing neoconservatism longer than most people probably even knew what the word neoconservatism means there. I've never, maybe back in like middle school, right? But I mean, since I've been an adult, it has never made any sense to me that the U.S. should take an overtly moralistic democracy promotion foreign policy. You act on the world stage in a way that redounds to your national interest. That is just pure, unadulterated common sense. So as an American realist, I look at the world stage and I conclude that China is by far the number one threat to the United States this century. So the question then for the grand strategists, the diplomats, the planners, and the question is, how can I prioritize diplomatically, militarily, resource-wise, et cetera? How can I prioritize China and the broader Indo-Pacific while simultaneously safeguarding our very real American interests in the Middle East when it comes to radical Islam, when it comes to making sure that ships can flow across the Red Sea without these radical Muslim pirates attacking American flag vessels there? Well, the obvious solution, which was the Trump administration's solution the first time around, is to embolden your allies, especially your one reliable ally, to patrol and secure the region in a way that you can basically hand off the baton there. So, people tend to overcomplicate this. For the vast majority of times, generally speaking, what Israel is going to do in its region, what the IDF, the military, is going to do, is directly, like unambiguously, in the American national interest. Now, no two countries are going to have literally 100% overlap, the U.S. and Canada. It's just not possible. It's literally not possible. But the overwhelming majority of the time that Israel is acting in a way that redounds to its national interests, that is also redounding to the American national interest. And basically all they ask in return is to basically just not throw them under the bus on the world stage. And so I realize I have not answered your question on the foreign aid thing. So I do call in the book for a mid to long-term winding down of foreign aid. Like many Americans, I tend to be skeptical of foreign aid myself. The particular arrangement between the U.S. and Israel tends to be mutually pernicious, I think, for actually both parties. So from an American perspective, the most recent MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, allocates roughly $3.8 billion in annual funding there. That has massive strings attached to it. First of all, that's no pittance. That's still $3.8 billion. But more important, arguably, is the fact that that money then, it doesn't just go to Israel. I mean, they have to basically spend it back in the United States, and specifically it goes to weapons and defense manufacturers. So the people that actually benefit from this aid end up being Boeing, Northrop Grumman, companies like that, which is why you have people like Lindsey Graham who have heavily, defense contractor lobbyists and supporters there. They tend to be the strongest supporters of this aid package there, not really the foreign policy realist types. And then from the Israeli perspective there, as you alluded to, this aid package ends up being a sword of Damocles of sorts that emboldens anti-Israel presidents such as Barack Obama and Joe Biden to kind of dangle the aid and say, oh, unless you micromanage your war in this precinct of Gaza and Khan Yunis or Rafah, and you're going to go into that tunnel, but not that tunnel, then we're going to cut the aid, we're going to cut the arms, we're going to cut you off at the hip there. So why would you want to embolden these very hostile actors? But even more profound is, if Israel, in my opinion, if Israel is too reliant on any other country, including even a great benevolent friend such as the United States, it undermines the entire purpose of Zionism itself. Because Zionism is nothing less than the Jews' ability to control their own fate in their own ancestral homeland. That's it. This word has been so tarred and feathered by hostile actors there. It's a very simple, I would argue, beautiful concept. But if Israel ends up being too overly reliant on American aid, Russian aid, Chinese aid, and any other kind of aid there, it undermines the entire purpose of Zionism, doesn't it? The Jews have to be self-determined and control their own fate in their own homeland. So even for a great, tremendous friend such as the United States, I don't think it, frankly, makes sense from an Israeli perspective in the long term as well.
All right. Well, I think we actually went a little long, but I really appreciate you hanging with me there. Josh Hammer has been my guest. The book is Israel and Civilization. There's links to buy it in the show notes, and I'll put some links to some of his other stuff as well. Josh, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Aaron.